Arman Tsarukyan absolutely destroyed Dan Hooker last night, and Ian Garry showed levels once again in his defeat of Belal Muhammad. So in today's video, I'm going to reflect on those victories, talk about a few things you might have missed from those fights, including the altercation afterwards between Ian Garry and Khamzat Chimaev, and then I'll end the video by talking about what's next for both Ian Garry and Arman Tsarukyan, at least what I think should be next. Anyway, guys, welcome back to Alex on MMA. Sorry it's been a while. I've been pretty busy with my job outside of this. I do interviews and presenting for various boxing and Muay Thai promotions. But anyway, I'm back now. Expect some more regular videos coming up. Let's get into last night's UFC Qatar. And it was a brilliant fight night, one of the best of the year. So many finishes up until that co-main event between Garry and Belal Muhammad. And that's where I want to start, because Ian Garry all fight week had been saying that he's just going to destroy Belal Muhammad, make light work of him. But we know how tough Belal Muhammad is. And it came as absolutely no surprise to me that Belal Muhammad survived those 3 rounds. But let's face it, Ian Garry was just shutting down absolutely everything Belal Muhammad had to offer. And when faced with a more technical striker like Ian Garry, it really exposed the limitations of Belal Muhammad's stand-up game. We've seen him stop Sean Brady before, but it is just that jab, jab, then right hand down the pipe or overhand right. And it was just so telegraphed, meaning that Ian Garry's head movement, his movement in general just looked so good. Because Belal Muhammad's striking was so straightforward, he knew exactly what he was going to throw. He never changed the rhythm, changed the levels. It was so basic, trying to force Garry's back against the fence and get the takedown. But one thing about Ian Garry, which makes him such an exceptional fighter, and quite rightly a #1 title contender, if that is to be the case after this fight, it's his movement. He never stops moving. And you could argue that one of his faults is maybe a lack of killer instinct, a lack of power in his hands, but that is kind of a consequence of his constant movement. It's that lateral movement. I wouldn't say that he's on his bike. He's not avoiding engaging with a fight, because he definitely does engage. He landed some really good shots last night. But the guy's always moving. He doesn't stand still, which makes him a really problematic opponent for a wrestler, which naturally makes that Islam Makhachev matchup really interesting. I'm not saying that Makhachev wouldn't be a heavy favourite heading into it, but Ian Garry's movement just impresses me so much. And that was really what showed the levels in this fight. Belal Muhammad marching forward, jab, jab, 2 straight through the middle. Garry easily able to avoid it and catch Belal Muhammad on the counters. Not only that, when Garry did decide to put it on Belal Muhammad, he was getting the better of the exchanges as well. But that wasn't the thing that impressed me the most. The thing that impressed me the most, and it impressed me in his fight against Shavkat, is Ian Garry's takedown defense. Now, for me, this is a mixture between Garry's natural physicality and his technique. The guy's just so awkward to take down. He stuffs the takedown immediately. He doesn't let his opponents get too deep on these takedowns. As soon as the opponent goes for a shot, you see him digging for those underhooks, trying to shuck them off against the fence. I'm just a big fan of Ian Garry at this point. I think he's so well-rounded. If you try and beat him at range, we'll see kind of what happened last night, where he can just pick off his opponents, move out the way from their shots and just land some of his own. Kind of a point fighting style, but maybe a little bit more engaging than that. I think the judges got it completely spot on, and I was really impressed with what I saw last night. Garry was able to frustrate Belal Muhammad on the feet. Let's talk about the eye pokes for a second, because the first one, definitely, Ian Garry needs to sort that out. The second one is a little bit more, I didn't really see a great angle for this one. It looked as though his hand was a lot more closed. And let's face it, if your hand is closed and you still make contact with the eye, you can hardly blame the fighters at that point. However, one thing that does concern me is that whenever Belal Muhammad did pressure forward, those hands of Ian Garry did come out. And I know that eye poking, I can't be bothered going over this topic again, but that natural reaction from Ian Garry is a reaction that we see from so many fighters. And eye pokes are just inevitable at this point, so we may as well just accept them. Give the first one a warning, second one take a point off, and then let's just move on with our lives. But anyway, just to recap this fight, Ian Garry looked great on the feet, used his range so well, mixed up the kicks, the takedowns, and from a defensive point of view, his movement looked fantastic. Amazing head movement when Belal Muhammad was clinching up against the fence and then trying to land one of those elbows. Garry was able to roll out the way and retake the center of the octagon. Really impressive. And then when Belal Muhammad decided to force the takedowns, Ian Garry Garry had an answer for that as well. Belal Muhammad got completely shut down, and fair play to Ian Garry. I'd like to see the fight between him and Makhachev next. Let's hope the UFC books it. Anyway, before we move on to the main event between Arman Tsarukyan and Dan Hooker, I do want to talk about the altercation between Ian Garry and Khamzat Chimaev. And I try and look at these things from both sides. One thing that I have learned from my time in combat sports is never to judge a clip in isolation. Because if you just take a look at that clip and have no context to it, then there's no question in my mind Khamzat Chimaev looks like the bad guy. And look, that could be the case. Ian Garry looked as though he was going up to congratulate Arman Tsarukyan. Had a little conversation with Khamzat, and then Khamzat, something just switched in his head and he pushed Ian Garry. Now, one thing I do want to say in Ian Garry's defense is that he has become a very easy target within the UFC because of the backlash that he gets from the fans. I think the fighters know, especially fighters not like Khamzat, but fighters if they have slightly lower profiles within the sport, they know that if they lump on Ian Garry, someone who for all intents and purposes actually seems like a pretty nice guy, but if people do lump on him, attack him personally, whether that's physically or verbally, then they do kind of gain some respect or some admiration from the fans. So I do definitely think there's probably a bit of that in this instance. Khamzat Chimaev thinks, look, I push Ian Garry, who cares? I'm just going to get a load of love online. But I do think ultimately it's the performances that are going to change the public's reaction towards Ian Garry. And more performances last night, I can see a lot more fans climbing on board. I'm already seeing a bit of a tide change in the comment section. And as far as that push goes, let's face it, it's much ado about nothing. Fighters being fighters. Khamzat Chimaev felt disrespected, probably. Ian Garry, there's probably a bit of something getting lost in translation there. But yeah, I don't think there was all that much that needs to be dissected there. Moving on to the main event between Arman Tsarukyan and Dan Hooker. And Arman Tsarukyan reminded everyone why he is the number one contender and should rightfully be fighting Ilia Topuria after this bout. Now, this one was really interesting because Dan Hooker looked huge in there. When that first bell rang, it looked as though these guys were in different weight divisions. However, Arman Tsarukyan just absolutely pieced him up on the feet in that first round and took him down with ease. Dan Hooker's got an amazing chin. I know that he did take a headbutt during one of the exchanges, but really, Arman Tsarukyan landed some beautiful shots on the feet, a lovely left hook that almost had Dan Hooker, that legendary chin of Dan Hooker, well, not quite legendary after Chandler cracked it, but the very good chin of Dan Hooker had him slightly wobbled, maybe stiffened for a split second. But then when Arman Tsarukyan decided to take it to the ground, it was all too easy for him. He was devastating with his ground and pound, kind of threatening submissions, but just getting a dominant position in that first round, piecing up Dan Hooker. And then if you saw Dan Hooker's face at the end of that first round with a massive hematoma across his brow line, I think the damage around the eye was caused by that headbutt, but you can't argue that the ground and pound didn't do a hell of a lot of damage as well. Then heading into round two, Dan Hooker was landing some really nice body kicks. I don't want this to be understated because it wasn't these pushing teeps, getting Arman Tsarukyan away from him. It was those stabbing front kicks that over the course of a 5-round fight that this was, those kicks are complete money in the bank. And they did seem to be having a bit of an effect on Tsarukyan. He was taking back steps after eating them. But that's about all I can say pro Dan Hooker in this second round. The rest of it was all Arman. Landed again some nice shots on the feet. Easily took down Dan Hooker. And then it was just a matter of time when he got the mount position, isolated one of Dan Hooker's arms, and you could just see the technique on display to get that arm triangle, slowly cinching up, isolating Hooker's arm, then getting his left arm around the neck of Dan Hooker, applying that squeeze, and you could just see it ticking over, getting steadily more and more tight. A real dominant display from Arman Tsarukyan. And one thing that had me worried before this fight is that so far in his career, Arman Tsarukyan almost seems to be a sort of master of his own downfall. Setting aside the missing of weight against Islam Makhachev, which potentially cost him 14 months out of his career. There's been other instances which have really had me questioning Tsarukyan. The fight against Oliveira, he put himself in some real bad positions there, and then losing a close fight against Gamrot. I just thought, is Arman Tsarukyan going to be this guy with bags of potential, but never really gets there? And Dan Hooker might not be the best litmus test for this. Hooker has lost many times in the lightweight division, but still, he can keep anyone honest. He can put anyone down. He's got those long knees, which are so effective against shorter fighters. fighters. But here, Arman Tsarukyan really impressed me. He was really cute with his work, effective. Everything that he did had bad intent on it. And I'd love to see that in a time where the UFC is being criticised for boring, lame prey fighters, eking out decisions with lame prey fighters. That's kind of the opposite of what Arman Tsarukyan did. Everything that he did in this fight was geared towards a finish, whether it was landing bombs on the feet, trying to pass Hooker's guard after he took him down. Everything was heading towards that finish, and I was really impressed. Like I said, that missing of weight against Islam Makhachev, when you look at that fight now and think, how long could Islam Makhachev keep fighting at lightweight for, heading into 34, 35 years of age, and Arman Tsarukyan entering his prime? The first fight between those two is very competitive. Imagine how that second fight would have looked. Unfortunately, it's highly unlikely we get that now. But I do think that the next best thing we can get for Arman Tsarukyan is the fight against Ilia Topuria. Now, I'm really split here because I think this fight would be incredible. At the same time, of course, I want to see Ilia against Islam. But hypothetically speaking, if we are saying we want to see Arman against Ilia next, how would that fight look? It's a real strange one because Arman Tsarukyan looked so physically in great shape in that fight. His striking looked crisp. His takedown looked great. But people forget, Ilia Topuria is the man in that division, knocking everyone out. Could Arman Tsarukyan stand up against the explosive power of Ilia Topuria? Hopefully we find out in January. Arman Tsarukyan hopped on the mic afterwards and asked for that fight. But it'll be a really, really intriguing one anyway. So let's see what happens there. But really, my main thoughts from last night is that Ian Garry is technically a brilliant fighter, so well-rounded. I really want to see how he matches up against Islam Makhachev. Now, Makhachev is a generational talent. But Ian Garry, if he performs at his very best, 10 out of 10, then he could cause an upset. I'm not saying it's completely out of the question. His range, his takedown defense could cause a frustrating night for Islam Makhachev. It could take him 4 or 5 rounds to get through to Garry. So I really want to see that fight. As for Arman Tsarukyan, he kind of showed us exactly what we thought about him anyway. We knew just how good this Armenian fighter was, and last night he just demonstrated it. Dan Hooker is levels below the guy. He took him down at will, got him out of there in the second round, and we need to see him against Ilia next. Arman reminded everyone that he's the #1 title contender, so I want to see him matched up against Topuria early 2026. But overall, a fantastic night of fights in the UFC. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this recap video. If you have done, please do like, comment below what you learned from the fights last night, and subscribe to the channel.